Welcome everyone to our lecture today. I'm very happy that we've got a humanities centered talk for this time. We haven't had too many of those lately. I don't have a full laudatory introduction for Tony Cascardi prepared, since I wasn't supposed to be emceeing today, but I known him for a number of years. He was chair of he was the Dean of Arts and Humanities for many of the years, my final years in office when I was active, and also for many years after it, and retired from that a couple of years ago. He's in comparative literature and rhetoric and Spanish and Portuguese. And I can't give you a summary of his books that he's written because I haven't prepared, but I know that he has just published a book on Goya. That's the basis of this talk, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to tell us. So Tony, without further ado.
Okay, thank you, Don. Thanks for stepping in. I imagine that Tom will find his way to the Zoom before long, and then maybe he'll be able to moderate the Q&A section. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's a thrill for me always to talk about Goya, even in these months after the official publication of the book, which is often a time when, as an author, you feel that you're kind of done with the project and it's in the past and you move on to the next thing. And although I have moved on to the next thing, I'm still very much a fan of Goya and the challenges and the questions and the problems that he poses. I want to begin by explaining how I found my way into this project. I'm not an art historian, and in some ways I had no business writing what is, for all intents and purposes, an art history book. But many years ago, decades ago, I was assigned, as part of my regular teaching duties in the Spanish department, a course entitled Spanish Culture. And I thought it would be a good idea if I taught something beyond literature, which is what I'm actually officially certified to do. And so I decided I would teach three artists, and they're probably three of the four best world-known Spanish artists. I decided I would teach a segment on Velázquez, and a segment on Picasso, and a segment on Goya. And I could handle myself reasonably well with Picasso because my other work had been concentrated in the period of the Renaissance and Baroque, and with Velázquez, self-consciousness and so forth. That was quite manageable. And with Picasso, because in an earlier phase of my career, much earlier, I had done a fair amount of work on Cubism. With that and just Picasso's boundless energy that seems to get transposed almost biologically into some of the art, that was manageable. But Goya absolutely stumped me. And it was one of those just incredibly challenging and ultimately rewarding experiences to have to figure out what on earth I would say about Goya. And I'll show some slides that I hope will present what I encountered as the problem or the question of Goya as I approach this course. And before I do show this array of slides, I just want to comment that in a place like Berkeley, as in many research universities, we say that our research informs our teaching. And that's, of course, quite true. But in this case, it was actually my teaching that came to pose a set of research problems that stayed with me. And it stayed with me in a kind of intellectual itch that just would not be satisfied, no matter how much or in what way I tried to scratch at it. So I want to begin showing you a version of what I encountered when I decided I would teach, I don't know, a week and a half to undergraduates on Goya. By the way, I have no recollection of what I actually did in that class, and I hope the undergraduates weren't too damaged by it. At the very least, they got to see some very interesting images. But truly, it was one of those experiences. There's an old joke when someone asks, in this joke, it's an English professor, have you read X? And the professor says, what do you mean read it? I haven't taught it yet. So this was my version of that. So Camille, if we could bring up the first batch of slides. Okay, that one you don't need because that's the doc. Camille, I want to make sure you have the most recent version of slides, the one I sent today.
Yes.
Okay, that's actually an advertisement for the book, which gives you a sense of just in the cover, actually, just the kind of craziness that Goya represents. This is somebody fighting a bull whose ankles are shackled on a table. It's kind of acrobatic bullfighting. But now we'll start with the images in earnest. So if we could just have the first slide, please. One of the best known of all Goya's paintings, a painting of the uprisings by the citizens of Madrid on the 2nd of May in 1808, a grand, large historical painting. Many of you may have seen it in the Prado. This is I'm just giving you examples of kind of the diversity and variety and expanse of Goya's work. The next slide, please. This is called the doll, the mannequin, el pelele in Spanish. It's one of the so-called tapestry cartoons. These were large-scale oil paintings. They intended really oil sketches that Goya made for the purposes of having the weavers at the Santa Barbara tapestry factory, the Royal Tapestry Factory, make tapestries for hanging in various royal residences. So you can see kind of the playfulness, but also some edginess to this image. Next, another one of the so-called tapestry cartoons. Some people would say this is an example of the Goya of lightness. A countryside scene with these very elegantly dressed. This is a very elegantly dressed couple. Next, please. Now we go to the disasters of war, which are a series of etchings that show the absolute horrors, gruesome, graphic of war, the Napoleonic Wars in Spain. And next, another image from the disasters. The titles, the captions are very, very difficult to translate. Very often they involve word plays. This in Spanish says fuerte cosa es. It's a really hard thing. It's a tough thing. Next, one of Goya's relatively early religious images, an image of the Last Supper. This one, if I'm not mistaken, is in Cadiz. It's one of the few that I haven't actually seen in purpose. So I guess I'll have to arrange a visit to Cadiz at some point. And I'll talk later about what I think is unusual, interesting about this painting. Next, this and the following image, but let's stay on this for a moment, Camille. The dome in a church in the periphery of Madrid, San Antonio de la Florida, a dome that shows the miracle of Saint Anthony. And I opened the book actually with an analysis of this painting, which is Goya's version of a kind of a secularized miracle setting. And I have some details that we'll look at later. But I'm just giving you an example of the incredible range. The next, please, is sorry, that's another excerpt from San Antonio. And the next, please. Just one of the decorative side panels in the church. Goya was an artist who could pretty much do anything, and he did pretty much everything. From very classical religious painting to those incredibly graphic and horrible images from the disasters of war. Next, an image from the series. Sorry, that's a detail from the St. Anthony miracle, and I'll turn again to that later. Next, one of the so-called black paintings. This, an image of Saturn devouring his son. These black paintings were painted directly on the walls of a house that Goya was living in, the so-called deaf man's house, the Quinta del Sordo. And I think we have another one of the black paintings coming up next. Next slide, this, I think, endlessly intriguing semi-sunken dog. And I'll say more about the color field nature of the background of this painting later. By the way, the so-called deaf man's house, many people are mistaken and think that it was named the deaf man's house because Goya was deaf. But in the sort of the irony of fate and circumstances, that was actually not the case. He in fact bought it from a deaf man. So it was named the Quinta del Sordo, the deaf man's estate, before Goya came into possession of it. Next, please. One of his very, very striking, incredibly well-disciplined portraits of aristocrats. So restrained, so proper, so well-contained and mannered, with a sense of decorum and poise and appropriateness. In some ways, it'd be hard to think of images more different than this and the images of the disasters of war. Another one of his aristocrats, next slide, please. The Count of Florida Blanca, this is Goya on the left in the image. You can see he's holding up an image to the Count of Florida Blanca, who had commissioned the painting from him. Okay, next. Again, Goya as a printmaker, the etchings from the so-called caprichos, which were the first images that Goya, in fact, made on his own, made without a commission, that is to say, it's a book divided into two halves, and I'll say more a little bit later about the differences between the two halves, but they have social satire of a very deep and cutting nature at their root. The caption on this one says, as far back as his grandfather, it's an ass. It refers to the interest in tracing genealogies. And this ass is trying to trace his genealogy. And of course, as far back as he goes, all he finds in this book are asses. Next. This is in fact the image that divides the two halves of the caprichos. The caption, which is very difficult to see in this image in particular, but it's on the pedestal. And it says, the sleep or the dream of reason produces monsters. El sueño de la razón produce monstruos. And you can see the bat-like, the creatures of night hovering around this figure who's fallen asleep at a desk, it appears. And it divides the two halves because following this image in the caprichos, all of the scenes take place at nighttime. And one of the questions that the collection of images raises is which is scarier, in fact, the things that go on in the world in broad daylight or the things that happen at night. The next image, please. One of Goya's very few but very impressive still lifes. These some pieces of meat, ribs, and a mutton head, it looks like, from a butcher shop. Again, difficult to imagine work as different as this and the portrait of Don Sebastian Martinez. And next, please. Okay, I think we're coming up to the end of this first set of images. One of Goya's many, many representations of bullfights. And in this case, one of the things I find interesting is what Goya does, in fact, to obscure the thing that we might be most interested in fact, looking at, just because of the confusion that's happening both in the center of the image and then off to the upper left. Okay, next. This one of many images, again, of bullfighting that show acrobatics of, what should one say, of an extreme kind, or pole vaulting between the horns of the bull. The image that I have on the cover of the book, as I was explaining, is a bullfighter standing on a table. If you have the book or see it and you open up the cover, you'll see that, or look at the image, the bullfighter is ostensibly going to jump off the table over the bull who's charging at the table with his ankle shackled, and we hope will expect it to land on his feet. Okay, next. Okay, this is our pause, and so thank you, Camille. With that, I simply wanted to give you a taste of the incredible range, the diversity, the variety, and I would say the disparity, the internal contradictions of Goya's work. The fact that he can represent aristocrats in the most poised and decorous and disciplined way. And at the same time, he can represent the horrors of war in the most gruesome, horrible, direct and graphic way. So as I prepared to teach this week-and-a-half segment on Goya for undergraduates, I had the question, which Goya do I choose? Or do I just show kind of a panoply of these images? And if I do that, then what on earth do I say about this? I'll tell you how I eventually came to take this as the research question of the book. But before I do that, I just want to give I want to put Goya in historical context, just so those of you who may not be familiar with him or where he sits in history will have some reference points. And I want to emphasize that what I do in the book and what I'm hoping to do here is not to explain Goya in relation to history, but simply by offering you these few details just to give you some way of locating him in historical context. I think my most useful historical reference point for Goya is Beethoven. They died exactly 1 year apart. Goya, nonetheless, was about close to 24 years older than Beethoven. So Goya spanned a much larger historical period. They died respectively, Goya in 1828 and Beethoven in 1827. Now, Goya's dates are 1746 to 1828, so a pretty long life. And if you think of what was going on in Europe and in the United States then during this time, it's an incredibly, it's a time of great ferment, of great change, of revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. It's also a time of great intellectual activity. Kant publishes the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, I believe is the date. He publishes his third critique in 1790. Hegel publishes the Phenomenology of Spirit, I believe the year of that is 1807. Beethoven writes his Eroica Symphony, and I think it was 1805, or was that 3? I have a note there somewhere. Yeah, that's right. 1803, I think, is the Eroica Symphony. So these are the things that are going on in relevant places. And Goya is, of course, situated in Spain. He was born in Zaragoza in Spain. He spent the vast majority of his life in Spain, much of it in Madrid. He did make a very important journey to Italy early on in his career, and I think learned some very important things. And we have some tremendously interesting evidence from his Italian sketchbooks of the kinds of things he was seeing and experimenting with in Italy. And dies after a short few years in Bordeaux, in France, exiled really because of the political conditions in Spain. So, as I said, these are just some ways of locating Goya historically. If you want descriptors, you could say he corresponds, to the transition from classicism to romanticism. He's at the height of the European Enlightenment, and one of my great questions in the book, because of the question that I think Goya's work raises, is what are the possible relationships to the European Enlightenment? So back to my puzzle, which is how to make sense of this incredible variety of images that we find in Goya. I, of course, started reading everything I could. And what I found was that all of the available explanations went in a centrifugal direction. That is to say, they went from the work to something outside the work and took that element outside the work as a way of explaining it. And of course, this is all none of this is implausible. So an explanation that is sometimes given for the strangeness of the black paintings in the Quinta del Sordo was that Goya had gone deaf. He was out of touch with the world. He was half crazy. He was suffering from, and he's been, ex post facto diagnosed with all kinds of illnesses as a way of explaining what's going on in those paintings, which is very interesting, except it doesn't really help you with any particular painting. And ultimately, you end up with what I would say you end up with the equivalent of a great interest in Beethoven's hair and not so much interest in Beethoven's music, if this were Beethoven. So you end up with a great interest in the nature of lead poisoning, which is one of the theories behind Goya's illness and his deafness, but not much actually about the paintings. Another explanation would be that he saw around him all of the failings of Spanish society, which was very hidebound and very traditional and very contradictory. And so he produced the Caprichos because Spanish society was this way. Or the great painting of the uprisings of the 3rd of May, it would look like a kind of representation of historical events that happened. It sort of, in that level, it kind of interprets itself. It tells us what it's about, and there you go. And the follow-up painting, which I'll show later, the execution of the Madrileños on the 3rd of May, likewise, just sort of shows what it's about. Similarly, the disasters of war have been taken as a kind of illustration of the horrors of the Napoleonic Wars, of the Napoleonic presence in Spain. And in fact, some critics have said Goya is actually a photorealist avant-la-lettre, photorealist before we had anything like photography available. And so the history, the events of the day, one could go on in this vein. The politics explain Goya. What's happening with the church in Spain and the lingering presence, nonetheless powerful presence of the Inquisition in Spain explains what's happening in some of the caprichos and also some of the disasters of war. Goya's biography, the fact that he was in love with the Duchess of Alba would explain other things. And so all of these kinds of explanations are out there, they're available, and as I said, they're quite plausible. But they left me unsatisfied because, as I said, they always went out away from the work, and they took the explanation as offering the kind of underpinnings or reasons or even causal factors of the work, and that seemed to me not quite right, not quite sufficient, and moreover, there was really no way to tie all this together. It's a vision. If you compile all of these different kinds of explanations, you get a very sort of patchwork, ad hoc, as it were, set of explanations of what's actually going on in this painting. And it seemed to me that the images were so puzzling and so intriguing that I felt that these explanations weren't really saying enough. And so a couple of things, so this was the puzzle, and I sat with this puzzle for actually quite a long time, until a few things happened. And I'll share with you a couple of things that I saw that offered me some insights into what I thought Goya was up to throughout his entire career, that provided, for me at least, some of the keys by which to unlock this mystery. Three things I would, and I noted about this image. Probably most important is the fact that he's looking askance. We see one eye that's sort of looking just aside, and the other eye we barely see. So rather than give us a frontal view, and remember, this is the image that precedes these many images of Spanish society, some by day in the first half and some by night. rather than an image of somebody who is looking directly at society and understanding that this is the image that's being presented to whoever would purchase this collection of images in the day, looking askance, looking obliquely at that viewer. The second is that he's wearing a top hat and overcoat, which suggests that he's very much the man of society. So he's looking askance at the viewer, a member of this society. He's also recognizing himself as part of it because he's dressed exactly as a member of society. And the third is what I think is a very, very subtle irony, and that is in the caption. The caption says, Francisco Goya y Lucientes Pintor, which is to say Francisco Goya y Lucientes painter. So he portrays himself as a painter in the frontispiece to a set of images that are not at all paintings. So what is Goya's own relationship to these images? So this is its own little puzzle. And on one trip to Madrid, and we could have the next image now, Camille. On one trip to Madrid, I happened to visit the Royal Engravery, which is located in the lower level of the San Fernando Academy of Fine Arts, of which Goya was the director at one point. And there you can see on display the copper plates of many of his etchings, including the caprichos. And if you see toward the left of this image is the copper plate of the frontispiece that we were just looking at. Maybe Camille, you can go to the next slide where I have them side by side. So what struck me about this, and maybe it struck me because I'm not an art historian and didn't know much about the whole printing, etching, printmaking process. But what struck me is that everything in the plate is reversed. It's not reversed just like a negative where things black and white are reversed, but it's reversed left and right also. So remember, Goya had to make a copper plate in a backwards version of everything he was then ultimately going to present. And I realized that this must have required a tremendous ability to see the world otherwise, to see it kind of backwards, or to see the backwards version of the things that are presented to our ordinary view frontally or forwards, I guess you would say. And kind of a light bulb went off at that moment, and another one that I'll share with you, that Goya must have had some ability to see the way things were and to see how they were very often presented as other than they truly were. And we can go to the next image. I'll offer another example of how some of this puzzle was, I think, unlocked for me. This is an image of somebody weaving a tapestry, and it has nothing. The particular tapestry and the particular individual have nothing to do with Goya. It's just the best one I could find of the kind of tapestry weaving method that was used in the Royal Tapestry Factory in Madrid. And by the way, you can still go visit that tapestry factory. And what I saw when I made the visit to the tapestry factory was that the weavers would sit behind the loom, facing the work that they were copying with their threads, weaving on the loom. So that means that they were never facing frontwards the work that they were producing. They were facing frontwards an image of that work that was, as it were, mirrored in the face of the tapestry. So I mentioned earlier and showed you a few images of Goya's so-called tapestry cartoons. These cartoons were large-scale oil sketches that Goya made, handed over, they were purchased, they were commissioned by the Royal Tapestry Works for the weavers to make into tapestries that would hang in these royal residences. And it's a virtual certainty that in his visits to the Royal Tapestry Factory, Goya saw these weavers working from behind and saw this mirror imaging process. For those of you who are interested, and this is a little bit of an aside, the actual process required an intermediate step, and that intermediate step was for the copyists in the tapestry works to make very sort of chunky, more block-like images on the basis of Goya's quite beautiful and nuanced paintings, so that it was easier for the tapestry weavers actually to copy the images. But when I saw the reversal in the copper plates, and I saw the tapestry weavers working from behind, I realized that Goya must have had some sense of what was required to see things other than as they presented themselves. To see things other than as they present themselves, and yet, as is the case with that wonderful frontispiece image of him with the top hat and the overcoat, recognizing that he's part of the world that presents itself just as it does in ordinary ways. So you remember we saw earlier the uprisings of the 2nd of May. This is the counterpart to that image, the executions of the 3rd of May, that raises a number of questions about Goya in relation to history. Quite obviously, on the right-hand side of the image, we see this firing squad. We see no faces in the firing squad. We see very clearly the shock and the kind of Christological pose of the individual being executed. And what's interesting about the firing squad, and that we don't see their faces, is which of course Goya could have depicted if he wanted, is that they're concealed from the field of view that we have accessible to us. It's interesting, I think, that these are mercenary troops that Napoleon hired. They're Turkish troops. The costumes identify them as Mamelukes. And let's go to the next image then. Okay, we're gonna skip Manet. I'll come back to Manet later. This is in fact the image that I was hoping to show you after the weaving, which gives you a sense of how Goya in the so-called cartoons for tapestries went just so far beyond purely decorative work. And in this and another image I'll show later, I think is one representation, one example of how Goya shows, in spite of his thoroughgoing critique, his thoroughgoing critical effort, shows at the end a tremendous sympathy for everything that he represents, even the most horrible things. Next, please. This again, an image from the Caprichos, where I think you can pretty easily grasp the resonance of the mirror image that's represented, and what I was describing as Goya's seeing things reversed. In this case, we're seeing this ugly older woman looking at herself in a mirror, who thinks she's going to be just beautiful until the end, until the very end, who is, unlike Goya himself, quite unaware of the fact that she is utterly self-deluded. Next. Another example of the same kind of thing from the Caprichos, again, hunting for teeth. The contradiction in this image lies in the fact that the woman who's going to pluck some teeth out of this corpse is herself just too afraid to look at the very thing that she's after, and of course doesn't even realize that contradiction. Next, please. Again, an example of Goya's representation of the world upside down. I said in relation to those copper plates, the Caprichos, how we could see things backwards. This is a representation of, instead of the beasts of burden carrying men carrying the beasts of burden. because they're, for reasons we could go on about, powerless. But again, an example of this, Goya seeing the world and representing it as upside down. Next, please. This is again one of the tapestry, so-called tapestry cartoons, and one of the things I find interesting about it is the fact that it's one of the images that actually presages some of his more directly critical, more explicitly critical images from later in his career. In this case, one boy standing on the back of another just in order to get some fruit. You could read this as utterly innocent, and I think the Goya's patrons no doubt took it as utterly innocent, but you could also see it as having the germs of something much more critical and in certain images than sinister. Next, please. In again, another one of the so-called tapestry cartoons could, on the one hand, look like just a couple of boys playing with a dog. But if you look at the size of the dog in relation to the boys, there's something that's really odd about this. The dog, who ought to be is imagined as the pet, is in some ways on a scale larger than the boys to whom it would belong. Next, please. Goya made many drawings. There are albums full of Goya's drawings. Many of them relate to the caprichos, to the disasters of war. This is an example of one of those kinds of images. A woman who looks, we don't know whether it's a mirror or a painting, but in any case, looks and sees a serpent. And it's called La Mujer Víbora, the woman viper. Next. Another one of the tapestry cartoons. Just as an aside, you can see these tapestry cartoon images are of many different shapes and proportions, and if you were to see them in person, you'd see the different sizes, in part because they were designed for very specific locations in houses. This one certainly for over a doorway. It could just, two cats, but these cats are not so innocent. They have a kind of natural violence that they're showing. And something else I find quite interesting about this image is the background, which is, if you took away the cats, you'd have a kind of color field, a kind of representation of nothing that might be a kind of modernist image. Next, please. One of Goya's later images, this along with the injured mason, I think are great examples of how throughout his long career that was, I think, relentlessly attached to the project of self-reflection and critique, is able to show a kind of a sympathy, in this case, a kind of a gratitude for this doctor, physician, who treated him in the course of one of his several illnesses. Okay. A couple of images. This one of the so-called black paintings. It's called Old Men Eating Soup. What's the difference between a human being and a skeleton? There's something very weird and odd about the kind of the facial expression, the distortion, the desire that's linked with something as very basic as eating. And if you think about the way the brushwork, the nature of the brushwork in this image, in comparison to some of the tapestry cartoons or the portraits of aristocrats, you can see a tremendous difference. And I think part of that difference has to do with the fact that Goya, as many later artists were, became very, very conscious of the medium in which he was working. Next image. Okay, I guess that was the last one we have. Thank you very much, Camille. Apologies to everyone listening for the hiccups and confusion in the exact images. It could have been any version of this great span and collection of images. So what's the argument of the book in relation to all of this? The argument is that Goya was ceaselessly, endlessly responding back to the very elements that are most often conventionally identified as explaining his work. So rather than see history as explaining Goya, we can see the images of the uprising of the 2nd of May and the executions of the 3rd of May as Goya's response to history. In the uprisings of the 2nd of May, and I won't ask Camille to go back to that image, but if you recall it, history is chaos, and Goya there are no clearly innocent, no clearly virtuous individuals in that image. History is chaos. It's violent, and it's not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily have a progressive nature or course that it's taking, and so and Goya is actually responding to that in the image. It's not that he painted the events. He could have painted anything. He could have painted it any way he wanted. He had that ability, but he chose to paint chaos instead. So too with the society around him. It wasn't that he was somehow influenced by a society that was full of superstition, or society that was full of vanity, or a society that was excessively hidebound in its traditional ways. He was actually observing it and responding critically to it. He was actually showing it to itself. In the case of the Caprichos, in fact, showing it to itself in a way that spoke truth so directly that he had to pull it after a few dozen copies were sold. Similarly, the disasters of war were never published until 35 years after he died. And so the Goya that I offer in this book, including the Goya of the frescoes of San Antonio, that great dome, is a Goya who is tremendously self-conscious. And he's self-conscious about his own role as a critic of the society. And it's the difference between being self-conscious of one's role as a critic and not being self-conscious of one's role as a critic that describes what I call critique. That is to say, that insistent self-consciousness. And I'll conclude with one final remark, and that is including self-consciousness about the nature of the medium in which he worked. It's sometimes said that Goya marks the beginning of modern art. Okay, you can throw a dart at a bulletin board of artists' images and pick the one you want as the beginning of the history of modern art. If there's a case to be made for Goya as beginning modern art, I think it is because he does understand the draw to a concentration on the medium itself. One of the stories that's very often told, and it's been a very influential story about the nature of the modern and especially modernism in art, is that it eventually sloughs off its relationship to everything except art itself, and ultimately its relationship to everything except its own medium. So the flatness of the canvas, the viscosity of the paint, the traces of the hand and the arm in the brushwork. And you see all that in Goya, and you see it very directly in the etchings, where he's supremely conscious of the medium that he's working in. You also see it in the nature of the paint itself, in some of the black paintings. Where I think Goya differs from that version of modernism in art is that he never forsakes the relationship between art and everything else that's around it. So art remains in constant dialogue with all of those things. And that means he doesn't end up in abstract expressionism. He doesn't end up as a kind of, a precursor of Jackson Pollock or of Robert Motherwell. He ends up in a place that is always engaged with some subject, with some figural representation, because that is his way, I think, of engaging in a project of critique that for him at least inevitably has to engage with the world around it. For anyone who goes to Madrid, you invariably see all the Goyas in the Prado. But after you've seen all the Goyas in the Prado, three things that are just so valuable. One is a visit to this church, the St. Anthony of the de la Florida, where that incredible secular miracle is depicted. The other is a visit to see the copper plates of the etchings in the royal engravery, and the other is a visit to the tapestry factory, just to see the how the process was and what Goya was involved in. So don't stop with the Prado if you're interested in Goya in Madrid.
I think we will draw to a close. We all thank you very much.
Thank you, Don.